Thank you for joining me for another episode of Empower Apps. My name is Leo Dion. We're joined again by Lucas Derraugh. Hey, Lucas. Good to have you back.
Yeah, good to be back.
So I wanted to continue our discussion on WWDC. I think the question that's on everybody's mind is, did you get a DTK?
I did not originally. My original thought was...
Okay.
Yeah, so when it first came out, I saw the price tag of $500, and I'm like, do I care? And I honestly, I couldn't find in the description whether I have to send the thing back. I mean, I think they do specify that you have to...
I think you do have to send the thing back, don't you?
Yes.
Okay.
The part that I was less clear on was, do I get any of my money back after?
Yes, yes. Because isn't that what they did in the old one when they switched to Intel? Was like you got like a voucher back to buy another.
I don't know, and okay. I read through the sort of PDF terms and conditions or whatever, and I didn't really. Maybe it's in there, and I just skimmed over it too fast. But
yeah.
I was at the end of the day. I said, well, if I assume either I'll get money back or they'll let me keep the unit, and so anyway, I did order one last week, and so I think it's supposed to arrive either tomorrow or Friday. So I should have it soon, but I don't have one at the moment.
What are you looking at specifically testing out on it?
Mostly GitUp, actually, which was that Git client we're talking about. And there's a lot of things with that client. It uses libgit2 and some other things to work. So it's a little more complicated of an application. And so I figured I may as well kind of test it out on that platform to make sure that it works. Other than that, I mean, I just like the idea of having one, I guess, as well. So just to see kind of what the future holds for macOS, and this is one transition that I think we've all been kind of expecting for a long time. So
yeah, absolutely.
And even while I was at Apple, which was only about a year ago at this point, I had never actually heard of them working on this. So not that I am that ingrained in too many of the things. I'm sure they were working on it, but it was a well-kept secret, I guess. So, and I think it shows because there weren't too many details that came out before Dub on what it was going to be. So,
well, it was a well-kept secret, but it was by no means a surprise at the same time, just because of all the issues with Intel. Yeah, but it seems like nobody at Apple, at least where you were, knew specific details about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't. We still don't really know specific details about it, I guess. But I think as far as performance goes, I'm sure somebody's gone and measured it or whatever. But I think somebody had used Geekbench, but I think it's running in like the emulation mode because it's not actually built for Apple Silicon. So I don't really know if that's a fair assessment on it either. But it'll be fun to see. I've heard that it boots almost instantly. So I'm excited to find out what it's like. But I mean. Historically, like we have already gone through this transition, and I did have a Mac that had the iMac G4, which the nice little lampshade kind of guy. And I remember having the Rosetta or whatever thing. I'm trying to remember if it was actually on that computer or not that had it, but there was one computer that I had at least at some point that had sort of the Rosetta thing going. And they even had like the macOS 9 boot up sort of thing that you could do where you could run macOS 9 applications and stuff like that. So they've gone through transitions of this before. It's not really new, and I don't really expect major fallout from it. I think the most interesting question will be the Windows story. I think that's what kind of is on everybody's mind. And I mean, personally, I don't care because I don't actually use Windows at all, but for those people that used it for boot camp for different applications, or if it was for playing a game here or there, then
or even virtual machines, right? Because your virtual machine has to use the same processor.
Yeah, I mean, I have to assume that Apple has kind of thought about this, and it sounded like they were thinking about virtual machines when they do it. I mean, they don't. Like internally, there's no doubt in my mind that they have thought through all these scenarios of what are they supposed to do with this thing, and how much is this going to be a problem, and I wouldn't be surprised if they already had Microsoft and some of these other virtual company or VMware and Parallels or whatever to get them to try out their stuff with the new thing. I'm sure they enlisted them about a year ago, so if not longer. But so I'm not too concerned about that. I mean, again, personally, I don't use Windows, so it's not really an issue at all. But again, I think there'll be some way, and it sounds like Windows ultimately might be kind of going the same way with their ARM stuff. I know that's been kind of a slow transition for them, but
my understanding was the Windows on ARM only works on like specific hardware. It's not like with Windows on Intel where you can just get a copy of Windows and slap it on any custom built PC. Whereas ARM, like it has to be built with the licensing. It's a legal thing where like the licensing only works on specific hardware. So I think like that's probably what is going to end up happening is either the emulation for Intel is so awesome that like you can run a standard x86 Windows copy on a VM, or the licensing stuff with ARM works out that you can just install ARM Windows on a Apple Silicon machine.
Yeah. I think the most interesting that I'm looking at is how the battery life of these things. I mean, obviously we're not getting units that are going to have a battery in them. So
right. It's essentially an iPad processor, right? That's what you get on the DTK. Yeah.
Well, that's, some version thereof. It isn't the iPad processor, but it is some variation thereof.
Okay.
At least I think I'll have to confirm that when I get it, but I just know how long the iPad can work. And I'm very curious to see, okay, given, the batteries that they put into Macs, which are generally pretty substantial, it would be interesting to see what kind of battery life performance they eke out of these things. Maybe it won't be really that significant. I mean, maybe it'll be basically the same thing. I don't know, but it definitely will be an interesting transition, and I think it's one that makes sense for them. I know certain people would agree, but with what Intel's been doing for the last 2-3 years or whatever, I think Apple's been kind of making leaps and bounds over them, at least in the mobile market. So if they have that same kind of dedication to the Mac, which I kind of assume they will, I'm not sure why I have that confidence necessarily, but for whatever reason, I think there's a good chance that they'll put some good thought and effort into it.
So it's that time of the year. You're probably trying to build that brand new app for iOS 14 that you want to get out in time for fall. But one thing you should probably think about is how are people going to find this new app? You could try to rely on your social media feed, but it might be a good idea to take a look at App Store optimization. And that's where Appfigures comes in. We've talked about Appfigures before on this podcast, and we've had Ariel, their CEO, on the show, talking about how you can optimize your app for the App Store. And they've just released brand new ASO teardowns, which have taken a look at some of the big names on the App Store, but also looked at some indie apps like Fotmob, which I'll have a link in the show notes below. These teardowns take a look step by step at what these apps are doing right and what they're doing wrong to get their name out on the App Store. And just recently, they've launched a brand new competitor intelligence report, which is live right now. These new competitor reports from Appfigures give you the ability to see competitor downloads, build performance benchmarks, and see new trends as they happen. You can see it in action by clicking the link in the episode notes below. So go ahead and give Appfigures a try for free. And if you like it, use our special code EMPOWER3030 to get 30% off for the next 3 months. Again, just go to appfigures.com and try it for free. Use our special code or the link in our show notes below to get 30% off for the next 3 months. I want to thank Appfigures for sponsoring our show. So you mentioned battery life. I put Big Sur on my laptop, and I have to say my battery life is just awful. On my, I have a 20, whatever the last model was before they switched over to the touch bar. I want to say 2015 or early 2016.
Okay.
But just my battery life is horrible. And I feel like my fan is just constantly running.
Yeah.
And I think especially with beta 2, I feel like things actually got a little bit worse.
Well, from what I've heard, it's basically iOS 14 was actually a fairly solid release, and Big Sur has been mediocre at best. I mean, I kind of expected that with the design changes because there are so many more blur type things that they're doing. And this is kind of what drives me nuts about the things that they do with some of these designs is that they they keep wanting to blur just about everything on the platform. And, they're not, especially with certain processors, right? And that might be the problem on some of these older machines is that they might not really be handling this as well as some of the newer machines do.
Right.
And I know internally, like, it's a huge struggle for them to try and maintain the support for older devices. And a lot of the times it does come down to sort of the graphics cards that are in older Macs, right? It's not quite the same as the iOS or the iPhone releases, and they just struggle to support all the different graphics cards that they have, and I don't think they really support all of them equally, I guess, if that makes sense. So, you know,
are there tweaks that I can make to like shut off certain features so it runs more smoothly?
Probably. It might be it might be an accessibility, though. I don't really know if there's much beyond like, reduce. I don't know. Reduce motion might be one of those things that gets rid of the blur stuff. I'm not really sure what. I'm sure somebody has looked up how to reduce some of the blur features, but as far as I know, I mean, you're probably not going to improve it too much with any standard settings. So.
Yeah. What's your overall thoughts on Big Sur as far as the design is concerned?
It's mixed. I mean, I'm glad that they wanted to put in some thought to redesigning it, but so I mean, there's a few different things. One is just the overall design of the contrast. So at least in the early betas that we've had, I'm looking at some of these apps and I'm almost struggling to figure out whether things are buttons or not, or if they're groups of buttons. I find that one to be very weird. Like I think it's in Finder where they have sort of the segmented control that it almost just looks like there's 3 or 4 buttons that are not really connected to each other, even though they are part of a group. And I know that, yes, if you hover over them, they do this weird thing that they kind of show you the size of which they're matched, which was another weird thing because in Finder, at least in beta 1, I haven't installed the second one, but the sizing of those outlines are slightly different depending, I think, on the image that they put in there. And it's like really, the highlight itself is just really irritating to me. But so there's like little things like this that are, I think from our perspective, they're fine because we might understand how macOS works already. But I just find the distinction between buttons and not buttons is not all that clear. I mean, obviously, if it's in the toolbar, it's probably a button. But I just think the distinctions are becoming very difficult. But even the buttons themselves, the contrast between button and the background is not very clear either. And so I think they're going to do some tweaks. I'm kind of surprised, honestly, by what came out of it, mostly because I know how much thought they put internally to accessibility. Like it's a thing that happens all the time, and I just feel like I don't know where the accessibility police were on this design, but it just seems like without changing some of the defaults, you're really going to be struggling to kind of find some of the distinctions. So it looks nice, I guess, but it's just one of those things that there's form over function, and I wouldn't be surprised if they change some of this by the end of the betas, and we've seen that before with previous OSs where
tone it down a bit.
Yeah, so that might happen, but overall, I think, I mean, it looks sleek, and I like some of the unified toolbar, sidebar kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think it looks good overall, but yeah, there weren't honestly a lot of changes other than the design itself, though, where I mean, if you look at the API changes for macOS, there's actually not that much. There's a very different look for all the existing APIs, but as far as new APIs go, it's very similar to previous years where there really isn't that much there. And again, this probably comes down to really the amount of effort that they've done internally to get Catalyst and get SwiftUI stuff working. So I'm sure that they did a lot of work throughout the year, but it always, when you look at the changes for AppKit, it's always like a one-page report basically on the differences. So it's a little disappointing in that regard, but again, I get it. There really aren't that many people on that team. So, there's only, I don't know, somewhere between 7 to 10 people on the AppKit team. So it's a fairly small team that has to do all the support for both Catalyst and SwiftUI. So between those two alone, I'm sure there's tons of stuff that they had to work on. So, and then the design for all this stuff. So.
Yeah, it seems like there's not a lot of challenges migrating to the new design, assuming you use a lot of built-in controls. Like as long as you stay away from customizing too much, I think, as is typical with a lot of Apple design APIs. It's like, if you don't stray too much from their native APIs, you're pretty good.
Yep. Yeah. And that's pretty much always how it's been. And they're really emphasizing this accent color thing where you can kind of pick your own accent color per app or whatever. I feel like that's their like fun design spice that you can do now. It's like, I know we have no real way of customizing a lot of these things anymore. So here's the color that you can add across your application. And so I don't know, it does. And that definitely has been the trend, is sort of to less customization, that they kind of are getting you more into a particular design mode. Again, not necessarily bad. It does help with continuity, and it helps definitely a lot for new people to the platform to understand the system standards, right? I mean, we all are used to the menu bar, and
right.
these kind of things do help, right? Everybody understands. For this is one of those things on Windows where the menu bars can be whatever, right? It can be completely different depending on what app you're in. And macOS was always nice in that way, where you understood how every application worked, because every application pretty much had the same layout for their menus. So there are obvious benefits to kind of conforming to what the system wants, but again, you are losing some of your ability to customize it. But yeah, I don't know. Overall, I like the design. I think they're probably going to make some tweaks on it before all is said and done, but I'm sure it's mostly going to be what it is, I guess.
So it seems like the bigger challenge is migrating your apps over to Apple Silicon, and it sounds like your biggest worry is with a lot of like the C library stuff with Git app, right?
I mean, it's not really, I wouldn't say it's a worry of mine. I think it's just GitHub is mostly just a more complicated application. Like it utilizes a fair amount of stuff for macOS that it's just worth testing on, I guess.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not, most applications for either iOS or macOS don't really have underlying C libraries, right? I mean, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but the majority of people that are starting with the platforms at least are going to use maybe some third-party Swift APIs, but for the most part,
or even Objective-C stuff.
Yeah, and Git's its own special challenge as well, where working internally, that was always something. I still remember when they were working on the new Apple file system, and at some point they totally broke some aspect of the time system, where then Git all of a sudden was very confused on the time of your system, and then it just like Git stopped working for that kind of whole release, or the internal release of that build. So there are things that are more complicated. I mean, Git's it is a complicated file structure basically. So not that Apple Silicon should really change how that works, but Git's not, it's not a small little sliver. It's not like running some different Swift code, right? I mean, I'm not really concerned about the Swift code. But these are the kind of things that, Apple, obviously, they're going to run through all the stuff that their applications run on. And so I'm sure a lot of apps internally are using C code as well. So I'm sure they've tested this out, and I don't really expect there to be issues, but it's just one of those things that it would be nice to have built one of these universal apps, so that when the platform does come out, we can be ready to ship it. So
my struggle right now with Speculid is that it does use like some C++ libraries, and like I started deep diving into like Makefiles and CMake in order to like change the architecture that it's built for. Like the actual C++ library. So that became a big challenge, to where I was just like I could waste a lot of time on this to get it to work on Apple Silicon, or I could just like wait for Lucas to get his DTK and he could build it for me. Cause like, it's just like, okay, like I get where this is coming from. And I'm like, yeah, cause like C++ stuff, I haven't done Makefiles in years. And it's like, oh man, like, I don't know if I really want to waste my time on this and just like, because like a lot of those Makefiles like are very specific to whatever processor you have on the machine. I'm just like not super averse into that stuff.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you and probably every other Mac or iOS developer.
Exactly.
But yeah, I expect that going through Xcode's probably not too big of a deal.
I think if you're doing anything, like you said, that's Objective-C or Swift, I think you're okay with just like building it with Xcode Universal, the universal version.
Yeah.
But it's when you start like having dependencies is where it becomes more challenging.
Right. And that's my main thought on why I'd want to test that out. And there's just other system aspects of it too. Like if you're doing sort of like, I'm trying to think of what the word is, but there's sort of different, like in a notarized application, there's different, it's not the right thing, the hardened runtime stuff that they have for macOS, and there's like different opt-ins for that, and so and GitHub has some of those that are used for whether it's running terminal and a bunch of other things. So there's little things like that I just want to make sure are going to end up working. But again, I don't expect it to be a problem for anything that's standard, and even for the C code stuff, I don't really expect it to be an issue either. But at least if I have a unit, I can go back and forth with the libgit2 folks, and if I don't know, maybe they won't have one, but maybe they will. And if we can at least work on any issues that we may or may not have. But again, I kind of assume that Apple has probably already tested a bunch of these things out, and it probably I wouldn't be surprised if it works, but worth trying out. So.
What are some other challenges you can think of when it comes to migrating an app over to Apple Silicon?
As far as developer goes, I don't really think there will be that many. I think the bigger challenge will be with people that have compiled binaries. I think is going to be the real challenge, right. and that is more of a challenge for bigger applications. I mean, most people that ship apps on iOS or macOS, they might use use CocoaPods to add in some third-party thing, but that's going to be all that will be recompiled with that application. But if you have an existing framework that was compiled before, and I assume those are going to have to be recompiled again in order to work in Apple Silicon. So anybody that has either any third-party pre-built framework, I think those are going to be the tricky ones to get working. So other than that, I don't really know all the details, obviously, for what makes any of this difficult. But I think as long as you can recompile the code, I don't really suspect that it'll be a huge problem. But I can report back to you when when all of it doesn't work.
Hey, I want to let you know that BrightDigit has openings for new clients. BrightDigit is my company, and we specialize in development in the Apple and Swift space. We're doing a lot of work helping clients update their apps for iOS 14, macOS Big Sur, and watchOS 7, as well as doing some recent server-side development in Swift with Vapor. Now is a great time to get started updating your apps. If you're interested in having BrightDigit help your team, reach out to me, leo@brightdigit.com, or go to brightdigit.com to learn more about how we can help you get ready for the big updates this October. Thanks again for listening to our show. Before we close out, I wanted to ask about one of the big differences with building a Mac app and selling and distributing a Mac app is you don't need the App Store. What do you think are some considerations to make if you're going to decide between distributing your app on the App Store over distributing it yourself?
Sure. So on the Mac, there's kind of a variety of different ways, I guess, you can go about it. So obviously, the App Store, the downside is that your 30% of your application proceeds are going away to Apple. And so that's obviously a big downside. The obvious upside is that you have a lot more of an audience. The other downside, though, for the App Store is that you are locked into sandboxing. So a lot of these more sort of, I don't want to say technical applications, but something that might use more of the system or wants to analyze the whole file system or something like that. So some of these might be a little more difficult to work with in a sandboxing environment. For example, if you want to be able to run a random terminal command from your application, it's pretty easy if you're not sandboxing. But if you're sandboxing, I still don't know if that's actually possible. I think you have to get some special entitlement to be able to do something like that. And unless you're shipping the actual program with your app, I don't think you can just like reach out into terminal and run any bash script or whatever. So those are the kind of things that, if you're trying to build some kind of more technical application, the App Store might not be an appropriate place to accomplish that. Again, for 95% of the applications or more, it's probably fine because you can probably accomplish everything you want within a sandbox environment anyway. But so that's kind of the App Store considerations. Now, selling yourself, you even here you have a few different options where you have Set App, which is kind of this subscription service that exists on macOS that they basically bundle a bunch of different applications that people can submit, and you have access to a list of I think it's like 200 applications or something that they keep at any given time, and you can kind of put your application to here. From what I've heard, the money's not necessarily that great coming from them either, because you're sharing it with whatever other people also are using your app. So, but maybe if your app's not that good, not selling, then it's worth a go to at least maybe get some exposure there. But the selling yourself aspect it can be a little bit more difficult, because then you do have to start thinking about licensing, and most people want to kind of just avoid that entirely. I know I think Microsoft has this thing called App Center, which I think they bought out Hockey App. Hockey App, which used to do a lot of this kind of stuff for you. But I think the App Center stuff from Microsoft now has the ability for you to basically, if they have an SDK and stuff that you can integrate to validate receipts and whatnot. So I think there is an option there. Again, I've never actually used it, so maybe I'm wrong about that, but that was my understanding of what's been available there for a while. And then your last option is kind of just rolling your own. But the thing here is that you're probably gonna create your own website anyway. But this website might have to be a little more complicated. Some people have gone the very straightforward route and said, well, screw licensing altogether. I'm just gonna put my app up on Gumroad or something like that, where people pay whatever $20 and they get the app as a binary. And then what you can do from there is you can integrate something like Sparkle, which is basically an auto updating functionality, and that's actually what we do for GitUp, which is pretty easy to use once you get it working anyway. You can pretty much just upload a binary to a page, and Sparkle does all the work to figure out whether there's a new binary available, and you can when you launch the app, you can be notified of a bundle. And for us, for GitUp, it's pretty straightforward. We're basically just zipping up a notarized application, and people will get it downloaded right to their computer as long as they have the app already installed. So it's there's definitely a lot of ways to go about it, but I think the most tricky part about selling yourself is just figuring out if you want to go down the route of a licensing model, or if you just kind of want to say, I'm not going to worry about that, and just you might lose some money there to piracy, where people can upload your app now and just download it for free somewhere on the web. But some people are willing to just pay for your app as well. So again, this is the Mac App Store, where things are usually priced at a reason, or in the Mac space, I should say, which is things are priced at a little more higher premium, and people are a little more willing to pay for something that's out there. So, but
I'm still considering this myself with Speculate, because I'm slowly transitioning to trying to get into the App Store. And I finally figured out sandboxing, which is just like one of the biggest challenges I feel like moving an app over to the App Store is. I wanted at least to see how big of a challenge it was, and I was able to get it to work pretty decently. But then it's also a developer tool at the same time. So it's like, okay, how do I allow people to run it command line as well, and figuring that out as well? It's a challenge, but when we had Daniel.
Did you get the command line stuff to work within your sandbox app?
I have the GUI app to work. So that's where I'm at right now. As far as the command line app, I haven't gotten that far yet. So I at least want the GUI to work first with SwiftUI and sandboxing. So I've got that part. And Daniel was on last year, and he had a really good point about there is marketing benefits to being in the Mac App Store for newbies. But if you already have an existing audience you can build on top of, then you're not going to gain any benefit from the Mac App Store necessarily.
For sure. And I mean, I guess that's another thing to mention with in general, if you are selling outside the Mac App Store, the best thing that you can probably do for yourself is get these people on a mailing list of some kind. So some kind of email correspondence where if you ever do sell something else or you have updates or whatever, now you can actually reach out to these people again, and they will, I'm not saying they will buy from you, but they're a much more likely audience to buy from you if you're building something that's similar to the first one that you built. So that's something you don't get with the Mac App Store, right? If you post one app and it does decently, and then you post,
you have no way to reach out to them.
You have no way of reaching out to that audience again. So, I mean, I shouldn't say that. You can through the first app if you, and I've seen this a bunch where people will try to basically advertise the other applications that people, what they've built, so that they'll then go to the Mac App Store and buy it from there. But also not quite the same thing, because people may have already uninstalled that application and maybe they don't open it that much anymore, right? So it's not the same as being able to send out an email to somebody just to say, hey, here's this new app if you're interested, and consider it. So there's sort of the long game of not having, obviously your profits taken by Apple, but also having your audience to kind of grow and being able to build it that way. So kind of depends what you're on for the long game for. If it's just a free app, then whatever, just put it in the App Store, I guess. But if you're trying to kind of grow something out of it, then I think selling, at least having the option of selling yourself, is a good option. And again, this is not an exclusive. It doesn't have to just be the App Store just selling yourself. There's tons of people that do both, and so don't feel like you have to choose necessarily one or the other. But I think sandboxing is always that thing, though, that from a developer perspective is probably the most difficult aspect of needing to be in, or to get over that hurdle to be in the App Store, where just simple examples of, I want to access this folder from the user, and it just becomes such a pain in the butt to get the user to drag the right folder in, and it assumes that they drag the right folder in or select the right folder. And I remember this was many years ago, that I did some contracting work for basically a disk cleaning utility, and the number of problems that we'd have from people that wouldn't select it, or even if they did select it, you just never would get the right thing. This became such a pain. Whereas without sandboxing, you could just say, go to the user's home folder, and ta-da, we now can access these folders. And it's unfortunate because 99% of the apps that are doing this, they're not malicious, right? They really just want a simple way to access the folders that are relevant to the application performing the way it does. But with a lot of this stuff, and I think the biggest thing that, unfortunately, this is now outside the Mac App Store now, where almost every new application you install now has some kind of permissions thing that it has to validate, whether it's,
and you have to relaunch the app, and it's like,
And the biggest thing is if you forget about it, and if you deny one of them, or you just kind of skip over it somehow, and then it doesn't work, and now all of a sudden it's like, I don't have audio in my application, or I don't have, the screen's not recording, and then you're just kind of left wondering why it's not doing this thing anymore. Honestly, the user experience from that alone, and I mean, I'm a very technical person, but I've still had this happen multiple times where I install something and it doesn't quite work the way I wanted it to, and it was probably because I denied some permission somewhere, or I skipped over it in some way, and then it just didn't ask me again, because unfortunately that's kind of how the APIs work from Apple. They don't, if you kind of just skip over it and don't answer the question, it doesn't necessarily ask you again, even if the app tries to access your screen recording, it just won't work. And that's from the API perspective, there's really no good way of knowing that it's not working, and it's just kind of a mess overall, unfortunately. And I don't know. I don't really have a good answer to how these things should work, but I feel like the APIs on Apple's end should be better on being able to detect whether the users actually have these things. So at least that way, the apps could recover from these cases where they expect particular things and don't get them. So,
are there any good UI guidelines for dealing with the sandbox? Because like right now, I just have like a little lock icon to let people know that they don't have access to a specific folder or whatever specific file dialog.
Yeah, I don't know of any real good paradigms that people are using for that. I mean, as far as accessing goes, the only two that I really know of are either using the open panel or you can use drag and drop. But as far as indicating that you don't have access to that, I don't think there's really there's not sort of an agreed upon.
Nothing good yet, anyways. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
maybe I'll make one.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the thing with a lot of macOS development, and if you are a Mac developer, and there's a lot of small projects, and these are things that I keep thinking of working on periodically as well. That having components that could help people achieve some of these simple problems that we keep hitting. Because, I mean, honestly, at this point, I don't think Apple is going to work on it too much. So it seems like they just kind of keep wanting to put more hurdles in your way of achieving the app that you want to achieve with the system, and which is unfortunate, but it's kind of how it is. So, but yeah.
Before we close out, what are some general guidelines you have when it comes to developing a good Mac app?
Yeah, so I mean, finding applications that you enjoy using, but also so the general things, I guess, are good keyboard support. So things that you can like an ideal application is something that I can pretty much navigate through the entire app just by using the keyboard. And if by default, I don't think this is on, but in system preferences, there is an option under I think it's keyboard. In one of the sections, there's the ability to toggle between all controls on macOS. And in my perfect Mac application, this is kind of one of those things where I want to be able to just hit the tab key if I want to get to a different control, and I should be able to get to the control by using either the arrows or tabs. And that's kind of one of the things I always look for a Mac application that I use a lot of, is the ability to not have to click on everything. And this is something that unfortunately, at least with I mean, I don't really know how the new Catalyst applications will behave. It sounds like they've improved a lot of this keyboard support, but it's certainly something that's very obvious to me is when you have a list of something and I can't just arrow through the list to access it. That's always like a huge red flag, as you didn't really work too hard on making this Mac app a Mac app, I guess. And maybe that's not the developer's fault, but that's certainly one thing that I look forward to, or look to, is the ability to access almost everything through keyboards. And then sort of along that same line, the keyboard shortcuts, right? If I'm on an item, I should be able to, in some way, maybe if it's a simple list of something, that I should be able to copy some value off of this list, or I should be able to dive into that item, right? So if I want to display it, I should be able to hit return or command down. Those are some common ways, at least, of accessing items depending on the situation. And so those are other things as well. For menu bar applications, I talked about this in the responder chain episode, where if you're just using a standard NS popover, make sure you're testing out all the different user scenarios. So if you're switching between a space, or you are using expose, right? So you're maybe so there's the expose to show your desktop and the expose to show all the different applications. And if you actually just use NS popover for a menu bar application, for example, that window just stays there while everything else moves out of the way. And ideally, you want everything to kind of be part of the same system, right? So it should, if I'm trying to show desktop, I really do want to move everything out of the way. So your app should not be the one that's standing in my way of doing those types of activities. Those are kind of the major things that I can think of. I think a lot of it really does come down to this keyboard support, though, and shortcut support. And just a small thing on shortcuts is, at least with AppKit, I have to kind of see what SwiftUI does for this, but all of your actions that you'd want to perform on a particular item, they probably should be menu items. So if you have an item, let's just say it's to zoom into a view, for example, right? So a way that you can achieve this is you could, on, say, for example, NS View, you can add the option of zooming in and out of, you could add that keyboard shortcut basically to listen for when there's a key down. And you could say, well, the person did a command plus or something like that, and therefore I should do this action. But the important thing about that is that this item is much more discoverable if it's in the menu bar. And so if you add this item to the menu bar, people can go either to the help menu and they can just type the term, which I do quite a bit. So if you didn't know that you can do this, you can go to the help menu on macOS and you can type. There's like a search bar in there. You can type, Zoom, for example, and it'll navigate to the area in the menu bar where that item exists. And this is extremely helpful for discoverability aspects of items. So if you want people to know that you can do these things, putting something in the menu bar, and in the menu bar, you can then add your keyboard shortcut, which will perform the action, and that'll go through the responder chain, which is obviously the title of my little section. But responder chain will allow you to go through the entire application depending on what view it is, and whatever view is supposed to respond to that. If it's the Zoom case, right, it'll respond appropriately to that Zoom command. So that's the appropriate place to put keyboard shortcuts is the menu bar. That's something that some people don't do correctly either. And the last little thing I guess I'd mention, and some applications do a good job of this, I think Pixelmator Pro comes to mind, where if you hover over different actions, some of them will give you tooltips on the keyboard command that you can actually use to activate that thing. So if you hover over sort of like the select button or the paint button or something, I think Pixelmator Pro at least, and I'm sure there's other applications, will actually show you the letter that you can press to activate that command, which is a great sort of discoverability aspect. And these are just kind of the pro things, right? I mean, it's not that some, people that are new to your application, they're probably not just going to be using these out of the gate, but you want to provide some way that your user can actually get better at your application, right? You don't want it just to be baseline for everybody. Ideally, if somebody uses your application on a daily basis, there should be some way that they can kind of improve their workflows. And from there, we could even go into automation and stuff like that. But that's a different topic of, altogether. I'm not going to go into AppleScript or anything like that. But anyway, you get the idea of, you can keep going with this where you start scripting the abilities in your applications, and basically just providing the people that want to do pro things on your application the ability to do those. That's kind of my biggest thing with if you're really trying to make like a full Mac application, I should be able to perform a lot of the standard functions without clicking them with a mouse. And that's where I find most of the Catalyst type applications will fail quite right out of the gate, is I almost have to click everything to get to anything that I want. So
yeah, and especially with like the keyboard shortcuts, I hope they bring more of that like to the iPad as well. Like it seems like there's a lot of good paradigms if they're going to make the iPad more productive that sound like should be followed on the Mac as well.
And the iPad has a nice sort of discoverability feature of I think it's like hold down the command key or something, and it shows you all the different commands. So, and there's actually a few different applications that on Mac OS, they're third-party ones, but they'll basically show you all the different commands that you can do in an application in kind of a nice way. I can't remember the app I recently was looking at, but anyway, the general idea is just having the discoverability options there and allowing your user to become better other than just clicking with their mouse. Because if you use the application on a daily basis, I mean, just think of using Xcode, right? If you didn't have the option to hit Command R to run your application, do all these different things, right? Like you'd probably get pretty frustrated, or at least it would be much slower, right? So keeping these little things in mind.
Yeah, I love keyboard shortcuts, and so it's definitely one pattern I hope more developers take advantage of. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's really great to have you, Lucas.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for having me.
Where can people find you online?
Yeah, so you can find me on YouTube is probably my main location, which is youtube.com/Apple Programming. You can look at the GitUp application if you want, which is at gitup.co. And you can also go to Twitter, where my Twitter handle is just my full name, Lucas Derraugh. And lastly, you can visit my website, which hasn't been updated in a while, but has some intent to change it at some point, which is just derraugh.com, which is lastname.com.
Well, thank you again. People can find me on Twitter at LeoGDion. My company is Bright Digit, which you can find at brightdigit.com. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks again, Leo.